All right, guys, here at this point in the video, just to remind you guys to hit that like button if you're watching this as a highlight here on Work the Game. And if you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to subscribe. Come check us out in the live shows for us to kind of break down and talk about what's going on within the world of MMOs, mainly Final Fantasy XIV. And we're going to talk right now about Chris's experience so far with Savage. I have yet to step into it. We're going to be stepping into that. But your likes on these videos and your comments on these videos are wonderful, and they help us out within the mighty YouTube algorithm. Chris, so far, what from the EX have you done, the EX trials, and how far have you made it into the Savage raid series for P5 to P8?
So I cleared EX4. Our group, the final clear of it was really clean. And so we thought, well, let's just grab another. If we do 4 of these, then we'll all get our weapon guaranteed because it's 10 totems. You get 2 per. And so let's just knock that out. And we did another 90 minutes of EX4. And that is how high-end content works. It giveth and it taketh away. We never got another clear. It was just something little every single pull for an entire lockout. We did not get another clear. So I did, I think, like 4 hours of EX4 and I got 1 clear in it. Had a blast. I'd love to go through and do more of it. It asks a lot of you, but I also think that like the timing between the mechanics is way more forgiving than a typical Savage. So I say it asks a lot of you, but as long as you know where you need to be, there starts to be a real fun to it, and you can kind of like count the mechanics. And you're like, okay, to the wall, spread. And like you start to get the hang of it. I do see how like a group of static members, where 8 people are, can almost laugh and joke because you could do the same thing every time, because the mechanics are pretty tolerant if you're with a group of people that's the same group every single time. But if you're swapping people out every couple pulls, there's definitely some room for like, oh, one person made a mistake and they took 3 with them. And so that's kind of part of it. I was hoping to have the extreme weapon because I have my tome pants and everything else is pentamelded. I pentamelded my own gear, which was immensely expensive. And so I am in full pentamelded gear. I did not get my extreme weapon. I ended up doing a pentamelded axe, which is not that far off in stats from the extreme, considering that out of P5, DPS isn't going to be the problem. It's going to be like, can you just literally survive the mechanics? So I went ahead and just went with a pentamelded axe into Savage because we'd already scheduled when we were going to do Savage. And it's like, well, let's just charge on. I'll come back and loop back for the extreme weapon. My penalty for not getting the extreme weapon beforehand is that I had to pay for the pentameld, and that'll just get yeeted. So I went into Savage with Farmer Girl calling the shots. A lot of mechanics make sense. If somebody's calling the shots for you, it all makes sense because there's a point where they basically say it's odds, evens, then like 1, then 4, or 1, then 3, or something like that. Yeah. And they say that pattern, and it's really easy to navigate. I can usually gauge the odds versus evens or evens versus odds. That all makes sense. That's really easy. Catching which quadrants. If your camera angle is not just right, it's easy to miss it. And if you miss it, it just goes poorly. So I get that a little wrong. And then there's another point where I have to gauge kind of where to drag the boss to as the main tank. And I don't always read that perfectly. Sometimes I read it right. Sometimes I don't. There's a bunch of like puddles and crystals, and you have to like gauge where the safe spot's going to be for everybody. And as the tank, like you need to see that almost immediately and be able to drag it there. The party has a little more time.
So let me get this right, just to kind of set, like what we're really talking about here, what I heard. You're saying that Farmer Girl not only is incredible and so generous in her support for our content, but also is an incredible raid caller. Man, it is a shame you are married. Wow, like that's like that, like the trifecta there. It's like having a good raid caller by far is a game changer in terms of content. But then let me just take a minute again to say thank you to Farmer Girl for helping out on both sides, both in terms of getting Chris into the content, but also helping making what we do here every day possible for you guys, as well as Floppy in chat with his support over the membership on YouTube. Now I really thought that the normal version was chaotic. One of the things I felt as a part of Endwalker's content is that it is time to move. Like it feels like a very movement-esque, update. And that's where it's like, oh man, as a healer, I felt that difficulty already on normal. You were going in as a tank, and I hear the door knocking, so I'm going to get these kids moving. But have you struggled in terms of that tank? Have you played any other roles within this kind of content, or are you going to pretty much stick with tanking?
I've only done tanking right now. I prefer to know how tanking works. I think it's a good viewing angle of the fight, so I think I get to see a lot of the other mechanics. I'd love to try a few. Healer seems to be the role that's taken the most pressure in P5 for Party Finder, just because it's so easy for everybody else to take dots, bleeds, deaths. So there's a lot of pressure, and it's very, very easy in both the extreme and in the savage for when somebody dies to take somebody with them. There's some like double puddle soaks. There's some things like there's some spreads in EX, and like if somebody messes it up, they can absolutely ruin somebody else's day while they're at it. And so just imagine for a second they take out one of the healers. That puts immense pressure on the remaining healer. So I think it looks like a really tough tier for healers. I am backed up by the fact that since I'm in Party Finder, if you look at the other Party Finders, it was not uncommon to see like, and there's 10 parties all at the same prog point, all missing 2 healers. So like it just looks like there is a shortage of healers that are ready to do that content. What I like about both EX4 and about P5 is as much as they're asking of us, neither one felt like it was an enormous jump in DPS. If you were all in the actual gear, the recommended gear, and that's only going to get easier, and you are all using food and potions, and everybody stays alive, you're probably going to clear both those fights. Even if not everybody stays alive, you're probably going to clear those fights. So what I like about it is there's just a lot of personal responsibility, and yet at a very high level. The Devour prog is where I'm at. I've made it past Devour a couple times, but I'm basically Devour prog like everybody else that's in P5 Party Finder.
Yeah.
If you're not getting a clear, it's because you're a Devour prog, and it's just a really unforgiving mechanic. We regularly go into Devour with 8 people. It's just that you don't come out of Devour with 8 people, and immediately after Devour, you need 2 light parties. And so when you look down and 6 are dead, you're like, well, this is going to go poorly.
Yeah.
And it does. So it's really hard. The strategies have been slowly getting updated, and as people are getting cleaner, it becomes clearer and clearer that like you can start closer to the center. It's less movement, which all of a sudden starts to make it to where like maybe you don't have to pop sprint, which means that sprint should make it only that much more forgiving. So I think as we get better at knowing the exact movement patterns, that'll get easier. It just feels like some previous Savage content I've done where like when you're first doing it, it feels frantic and like, how can I possibly get there? And then as you get better at the mechanic, you realize I have all the time in the world. This is not a big deal. So I'm having a lot of fun in it. It's definitely a fight like that I would prefer to do with comms. And I would definitely prefer to do it with people that you already kind of like are willing to laugh with. And maybe that's strangers. Like sometimes that works out. But I was in chat and it was just me, Farmagirl, and Fido, and like we were having a great time. It was only the 3 of us were in the voice comms, and I had a blast. And even when I listen to other raid groups, like as long as they're all comfortable with each other in comms, 5 is a fun set of problems to solve, and I can't wait to get into 6.
When it comes down to so far what you've experienced, obviously the Savage Raid is a next level tier up from the extremes, but you've also been doing the extremes this expansion so far. Have you run into how would you rate the current set of extremes, like with the current one? Like, do you have a favorite? Do you feel one is it more forgiving or unforgiving than any of the others so far?
So I went late to the other ones because you and I were chasing Omni 90 and doing level 90 content was actively in the way of that. So I don't know how much of that's just the fact that I'm going into EX4 like so quick. This is my first time to ever do Savage week 1. And so like, I don't know if it's that I'm just going into it so early in the tier, but EX4 punches. Like EX4 is like, even just both, same with P5. My God, in P5, like just the auto attacks on the tank hurt.
Yeah.
And so like you feel it as a tank where you just see your life just getting chomped. And you're like, what is happening? Like, I just feel naked in those fights. And considering how much time and money I spent crafting and pentamelding my own tank set, you're like, what did I do this for? Like, this stuff is tissue paper. So I feel like I just get pounded. Occasionally, tank privilege still shines through, but usually not without Mitt. Usually, if I'm tank privileging, it's because I popped Mitt and then watched somebody near me die. But oftentimes, like, I find myself dead a lot if I make mistakes. but I don't mind it. Like, I actually was disappointed. My very first like on patch extreme that I did was Diamond, and Diamond weapon at the end of Shadowbringers, like we almost downed at our first pull, and it was late into Diamond, and we're like the people I was with all knew where they needed to be, and I'd watched the guide 16,000 times. And we almost got it down, and then we did get it down on second pull, and there was something about that you're like, should that really be called the word extreme? This feels like it should be. This feels like, okay, there's a lot of mechanics, they vary, I need to know exactly which one I'm doing. There really isn't there's not a ton of time before there's like 2 parts to each mechanic. There's like a part 1, part 2. There's not that much time before you need to at least recognize the pattern, and then you adjust to the part 1. Then there's actually a small delay because it's extreme, not savage, and then there's the part 2. And so you've actually got a little bit of a window there. But the initial like, what are we doing? You've just got to be able to see it, or you've got to be able to hear it from a raid caller and immediately respond. So I think it'll get better as people start to get cleaner and cleaner at where they put markers, and as they get better. Devour, for example, already as the second strategy comes out, it's way cleaner. It's a lot less movement. It's a lot less reading. You're like, oh, it's pattern A or it's pattern B, and I just move around the middle. And so even then, as I was getting clipped by it with this newer strategy, I at least was getting clipped by it, and I was like, oh yeah, I forgot to turn back. Like, at least it was very clear of like, here's what I need to do different. I can see the path where I should have been. Now it's just a matter of getting my character to where my eyes wanted it to be.
When it comes down to it, that's one of the things I see Estin here saying, Yoshi here the hear complaints about not healing enough, and said, all right, hold my sake. I honestly feel like overall, even in the normals, that I was like, oh, it feels like I have more to do, because when we were originally talking about all the kind of the homogenization, the easing of kind of your healer toolkit in terms of damage, it's like, well, that's perfectly fine, but I want content to heal on. Like, I feel like as long as that is something that's happening, then I'm going to be good. And this definitely, at least at the start, like it'll be interesting to see how we feel as healers as our gear level goes up, and if it ends up having that same level of demand on the party. Now, while I haven't stepped into the extremes and the savages, that literally is my plan to hopefully get that kicked off this week as I wrap up Dancer and then just finish off the last 18 levels until I'm Omni 90. So that's going to be happening hopefully this week, and then next week, as I've been going to be streaming Mondays and Tuesday evenings for Final Fantasy over on Twitch. If you guys haven't heard of us over on Twitch, you can check it out. Links are pinned and all that good stuff. And what have you. But I've only kind of seen and watched like several prog groups, and I've seen like your content, and it looks good. Like it's I enjoy these kind of things. I think what I'm going to really appreciate is when I'm Omni 90, I'm not going to feel this sense of like that's like, oh, I still got to get that. I'm not getting XP in this fight, etc. And that's just my personal thing. But I have to say, I'm really more interested in Criterion, and even Criterion Savage. And the only reason why I feel like I want to jump into Savage now is to actually help with my gear for Criterion Savage. Not that I think it's not going to be required overall, but I believe that is going to be something that helps. Am I wrong in that? Like, did I mishear that, or is that something that I'm, right
It does sound like it's going to be gear relevant. The question is then, does it do anything about that? Does it act as a catch-up mechanic where it drops Savage level gear, but is always later? Does it drop just under Savage level gear? So does it kind of replace that crafting pentameld step or that tombstone step? So there are some questions about like what it does as far as gearing. If it's too good for gearing, it'll become required if it ever pushes up against a prog point. But if it's always a half patch behind, it won't matter. The world first raise will be long over. And so like there is a question there to like, what does it do gearing wise? It should be a part of it. It sounds like they do want it to be at least somewhat gear relevant. The question is, how much does balance matter? Right now on P8, because there's a damage check, paladins and warriors are the better mitigation tanks. And so as you move into a fight where you move to the point that it's in rage, the answer to mitigation is don't get hit by stuff. And if you're not getting hit by stuff, mitigation loses its value. And all of a sudden, Dark Knight and Gunbreaker become the all-stars. And there's very few clear groups posting up with warriors and paladins present. It's mostly Dark Knight Gunbreaker, and so you're starting to see frustration in certain members of the community that are having to switch off of being warrior mains. As I saw Todd, sliding into Dark Knight, as I saw Zeno sliding off of warrior, and of course he makes his emotions well known on that. So there is some frustration with job balance. You're seeing like basically no machinists in this content. So the question with Criterion Savage is like at the variant level, it's literally not going to matter. At normal Savage, if you're a talented player, it probably still won't matter. And hopefully it doesn't matter regardless. But at the Savage level, how tightly tuned is it? If it's tightly tuned and a class has a 3% advantage, that's what's going to win out. And you want something tightly tuned because that's the challenge. But then you run the risk of now you don't have 3 physical ranged available. You have 2 or maybe just 1 because the balance kind of pushes somebody out.
Yeah. I'm just very excited about that. I think it's going to be interesting to see. That does also, we'll have to see what kind of updates to the jobs, like you said, because if Yoshi P always wants to make every job viable, in that regards. And obviously as people then find those preferences, that's data that they take in, and that's something that we might see. And I don't know if we'll see what we saw this spring when it came to the PvP, like, hey, we have these updates, and it turns out like that didn't work out. So I don't know if we'll ever see one of those A or B patches again. But in terms of the job balances themselves, we do know the half patch could bring some of that in, especially once they start looking at the data. We know they really look at this data. So if these preferences are felt, I could expect that we'll see some more job adjustments here in the near future.
And for any warriors that are just getting into Savage and they're concerned they won't get through P8, Gear is going to cover some of that. So like you see it highly pronounced in the top end community who are capable of executing at a top level across multiple jobs. Because that's the other thing is like people telling me to move to Dark Knight, that's not going to give you the response you think you wanted. Like, is my Dark Knight leveled? Yes. Can it wear my warrior gear? Sure. But you're not going to like what you get if you force me to move to a job that I'm not as comfortable on. I'm already making mistakes as warrior. I'm not worried about getting my P8 clear on my warrior because it's going to take me so many weeks to get there that the gear will just replace it. Yeah. Other people will have replaced the 450 to 600 damage that swap does. So it depends on your pace. If you're a week 1 clearer, yeah, just as like a future recommendation, it's so easy to keep jobs geared in this game. I would recommend that you have 2 jobs within your role that you can go put that Savage gear on so that you have the ability to switch back to your main when that makes sense, if your main is ever on the receiving end of being the weaker one in its role. So if you're a tank that likes being a warrior tank, I recommend you pick another tank, especially if they're pairing warrior and paladin and Dark Knight and Gunbreaker. Go pick Dark Knight or Gunbreaker and go get really good at that one. That way you've got some flexibility, and I think that really helps kind of offset this, because this time around it's machinist, but what if next expansion it's dancer? And you like dancer? Well, it's like, okay, well then week 1 you're on machinist, and then you get to switch back over when that makes more sense.
Absolutely. And that's also always a good role, like in terms of like when it comes down to it, that having that flexibility to flex on other roles or other jobs within a said role in and of itself. And sometimes like the thing that still boggles my mind is those who have multiple characters. And that's something that you said to me, like there might end up being a goal that you end up having is multiple characters all within, kind of massive amounts of levels, etc. So to those who do it, tip of the hat, man. Tip of the hat.
Mine will have to happen because I have a story character, right? Yeah. So because I play MMOs my way, where I'm having a lot of fun on my main and I skip a lot of story, I have a story alt, and that's what I'm on this week. And so I end up with 2 characters, at least Omni 80, because that's where the class quests go to.
Yeah.
So, and then after you're Omni 80, it's like, well, if you start laying on tribal quests and you want to get to know those stories and you start doing basically anything else, you end up Omni 90. Like the 80 to 90 jump is not hard.
Yeah.
So that's kind of part of it.